a decorating series. We did one last week on piping, and we did one the week before on how to bake your own buttercream. So this is kind of the culmination of the intro class. The topic tonight is going to be fondant, and your kind of basics, the things that are helpful to remember. Fondant is one of those things that the more you work with it, the more comfortable you'll become. I like to think about it as edible Play-Doh. It's a little sticky sometimes. You can mold it into beautiful shapes. You can use your average cookie cutter to make whatever decorations you want for your cake. There are various tools that you can buy to use. There are extruders that it looks very much like Play-Doh tools to pipe out ropes. There are silicone molds that you can use to make different shapes. So just depending on how much you want to do and how much you want to invest, there are lots of options. I have recently discovered Hobby Lobby. I live in Port Jeff, so I don't get down into that Smithtown area all too much, but a friend took me to Hobby Lobby recently, and what an amazing decorating section they had. So if you're in that area and you've had a chance to visit the Hobby Lobby decorating section, it was amazing. I would like to say I could spend lots of time in that aisle. Michael's and Walmart also have good options for tools and cutters and even fondant supplies itself. I do tend to order even on Amazon. The prices tend to be the best for the larger purchases. But fondant comes in all different brands. There's the standard Wilton box, the Wilton packages that come in, kind of a small brick that is enough for kind of your decorating needs. And then they come in an 8-ounce box that will cover an 8-inch cake. There's this brand called Fondant. This is an Amazon purchase. The Fondant I find is very sticky, and it's a little bit hard to work with. It doesn't get as firm as some of the other brands. My very favorite brand to work with, though, is called Satin Ice, and that you can buy at Michael's. You can buy, I believe I have it at Walmart, but I tend to just order it online because the prices tend to be cheaper on Amazon. You can buy it at Carrie's Candies. They have also have some cake decorating supplies, but the Satin Ice brand is my favorite, and I like it because it tastes the best, and I find that it's the easiest to work with. So it has a good hand feel. Like it's nice and smooth to work with. I don't find that it dries out. The Wilton stuff I find you have to use right away or it gets kind of hard and crusty. So the red that you have in your kit was that Satin Ice brand. And I'm not sure if anybody's going to be working alongside us tonight, but we did ask you to have about 4 ounces of fondant otherwise that you could use for covering your cake. So we're going to start there and talk about the basics of cake covering before we add fondant. So fondant itself is like a sticky dough, right? But it needs something to adhere to your cake with. So you need a base layer of frosting to add to your cake, and then your fondant will stick to the frosting. So you need a crumb coat of frosting on your cake. I'm going to put just a little bit on my cake surface, and I'm going to spread it around. You really are just giving the fondant something to stick to. You don't want to do too much. If you add too much frosting to your cake, your fondant will slide. So I have in the past had that experience happen where I added just slightly too much frosting underneath, and my fondant wouldn't stick. It slid right off the cake, which that's not going to be good for any kind of decorating purposes. So you're going to just cover this with a quick crumb coat. And I do find that the fondant has the best adhesion when this has a chance to dry a little bit. You almost want it to be like less than tacky. So you're going to let it crust just a smidge. So we're going to crumb coat, and then we're going to set it aside. You want to make sure that you get the edges smooth so they don't bump through, because your fondant will show all of the imperfections of whatever's underneath it. So you put on a nice coat of frosting, fill in all of those holes that you might have. or if there was, a place where your cake stuck coming out of the pan, you can cover that up with a block of icing and then just smooth out over it. You want to make sure that you have a nice smooth top and smooth around the sides, because when we lay our fondant over, it's going to stick to those bumps. And if there's too much frosting, it's all going to gush out the bottom. And if there's not enough frosting, your fondant won't stick to the cake. So it's this careful balance of enough frosting to stick, but not so much that it's going to ooze. So that is my frosted crumb coat. I'm going to set that aside for a few minutes. I think that most people have done these classes with me before, but for anybody who might be new, my name is Danielle. I run an online bakery called The Bite Size Bake Shop. We have a pretty active Facebook page and Instagram. We do all kinds of treats. We do bite size, we do regular size, we do cakes and cookies and muffins. I made scones today for an order. We're pretty much a full service online bakery. We've been around since 2013. That's when I kind of opened the bake shop. I was doing I was a management consultant for about 10 years before that, but baking was my passion, and I decided that that's what I wanted to do. So I had the support of my husband, and he said, all right, let's do it. So we jumped into the Bite Size Bake Shop. I sold every week at the Porta Farmers Market for about 3 years, early on Sunday mornings. I bought all my equipment. I laid all my cupcakes out, and I built a great following. So I have lots of local support, which is fantastic. And I started teaching classes. So I teach adult classes here through the Middle Country Public Library. I was working with the North Shore Montessori School to do some kids baking classes for a number of years. With COVID, the classes have moved to an online format, but I'm hopeful to get back in person. I do run
before this is over.
And last summer we did that in my backyard because there were no locations that were open to people yet. So we're hopeful to get back to some kind of kids baking program in the near future. But that said, I would encourage you to do what makes your heart happy. Baking makes my heart happy, and I always end up with stuff around. There's always treats. We always bring treats wherever we go. My daughter is going to turn 13 on Sunday, and she wants to bring treats to school on Friday. So my kids have gotten into the habit of making their own stuff. They can make their own cakes and cookies and cupcakes. So it's nice to have that bond to share with my family as well. So all of that is my little background and introduction to say thank you for joining me tonight, baking along and decorating along with me. It's been a real pleasure to do this with the Middle Country Public Library, and I would like to say thank you to them for having me as well. So our cake is ice, right? We set it aside. Our crust, our frosting is crusting right now. Still a little tacky, so we're gonna let that set for a minute. And I would like you to pull out the chunk that you're gonna use, chunk of fondant that you're gonna use for your base, your base covering. So fondant works best when it's at room temperature. You definitely don't want to store your fondant long-term in the fridge or the freezer because it'll be too hard to roll. You want it to be nice and pliable. This lump pile of yellow is left over from another cake. I do tend to try to be, conservative with what I'm using so that I can get multiple cake uses out of a piece of fondant. But you don't want to use too little fondant, because if you try to roll the fondant too thin, it will tear when you try to put it on your cake. So the general rule of thumb is you want your fondant cover to be enough to cover the diameter of your cake plus whatever the height is. So this is a 6-inch round, and it's about an inch high because it's just a single layer. So I'm going to need a minimum of a 7-inch circle in order to cover my cake fully with this round of fondant. So if you, I know I can eyeball that now just from the number of fondants that I've rolled, but if it's helpful for you to actually draw out a circle that is the size that you need, they also have pre-measured mats that you can buy to get your circle the right size. Go ahead and do that. No, nobody's gonna know. And then this way you have the right amount of fondant to work with. So you'll see that I am using this very high-tech piece of equipment right now. This is a piece of PVC pipe. I like this the best for rolling because I feel like I can fit my hands around it nicely, and it's nice and smooth. It's easy to clean up. There's no little pores in it like you get with a wooden rolling pin that I have to worry about bacteria or germs. I can put it in a dishwasher. And when I do my kids' classes, I find that this is a good size for their little hands as well, too. So if you have little ones at home that you're gonna bake alongside, think about it. I went to the hardware store and I had them cut this piece of PVC into pieces. I just said, I want this, I think it's a 3/4 inch PVC pipe that they cut into 12-inch pieces for me. Well, that said, I do have a fancy rolling pin. This is my fancy depth. It has these depth cutters that you can use. I use this more for rolling cookies, but if I need something with a little more heft to it, if my fondant is particularly hard or I'm having trouble working it, the heavier rolling pin smooths it out a little bit easier. So it's really a matter of comfort, but you definitely don't need any fancy tools for this kind of stuff. You can make do with what you have in your kitchen. I've rolled out with wine bottles before, so it's all doable. In terms of depth, I don't know if you can see this in the camera. There we go. This is pretty thin. You know, it's about 1/4 inch. I would suggest to have your fondant piece, whatever the base layer is, don't go any thinner than about 1/4 inch, because if it's too thin, I said it could break when you put it over your cake. When you're going to move your circle of fondant, this one is not so hard to move because it's small. But as you get bigger, the piece of fondant that you're going to be working with can be a little unwieldy. So I will take my rolling pin and I will gently roll the fondant onto my rolling pin, just like this. And it doesn't tend to stick to itself yet. And I will move my cake over. And then my fondant is kind of ready to roll out. So I will gently drape it over the top of my cake. And before I start pressing down, I'm going to want to eyeball it and make sure that it's going to fit. And I might have to adjust the placement. And you want to make sure that it's going to fit all the way around. So this one does. So I'm going to pat it with my hand. They have all kinds of fancy fondant smoothers that you can buy at the Michael's or the Walmart or Hobby Lobby. But I find if you take your hand, one on the top, and then you're going to use the back side here of your other palm to kind of cradle in around the bottom and make that crease. That's going to give us a nice smooth surface to work with. So we're pressing down on the top, and that's going to prevent any air bubbles from forming on the top of the fondant, because you're really trapping some air in there, right? And then we're going to press down to find the bottom of our cake. So then you have a nice cake shape. You can see that. There's our cake shape, right? It's covered. All of our edge is covered in fondant. And I'm going to take my knife. You should have a sharp paring knife, or again, there are tools that you can buy that are made for cutting fondant, but I find that my nice sharp knife works just as well. I'm going to cut down and away from the bottom of my cake. And that's going to give me a nice edge there on the bottom. And you're going to follow the edge of the cake all the way around and move the extra fondant out of the way as you're going. So just go all the way around. And depending on what you wanted to do in terms of decoration, I do tend to put borders on the bottom of my cake rounds, whether it's along like a skinny rope, or one of my favorite borders is there's a silicone mold that you can buy that makes little pearls. And you would dust the silicone mold with cornstarch and push your fondant in, and then let it dry for a few minutes. And then when you pop them all out, all your little balls are exactly the same size. So if there's if you ever wondered those beautiful cakes that you see where everything is exactly the same size, it's because they've used a mold, because it is nearly impossible to roll that by hand identically for however many balls you would need to go around your cake. So the tools are out there if you want to invest in them. Definitely look into that. So there is my fondanted, my base layer. You can see I have some spots here where I cut away from the fondant. It's just a little bit, not quite all the way. You can take your hand and use it to work the fondant down a little bit in that area. And it should cover up the hole. The fondant still has some plasticity to it. So it's gonna smooth and round. And then I ended up with a little bit more here. So I smoothed it down, I covered that hole, and I'm just gonna cut away that extra. And there is my covered cake. Questions about using that fondant for the base layer? We're gonna set the base layer aside, and we're gonna talk a little bit about decoration. So fondant is great for working with because you can use a variety of tools and cutters. There are things you can buy, I mentioned specifically how to work with fondant, but any cookie cutter will cut fondant. You don't need anything super special. The red fondant that I gave you, we're going to use to make some roses. So if you are working alongside, you want to go ahead and grab your little chunk of red fondant. And I'm going to just work this for a minute because it's a little bit hard. This cutter that I included in your bag is called a Petal Cutter. And it has 10 bumps, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 5 on each side. And again, it comes in a variety of sizes. So there's a big one and a medium one and a small one. So it will make 3 different size roses. So when you're thinking about cake decorating, you try to think about balance and symmetry, and you want to make sure that there's not too much going on your cake. So you would pick a few design elements. If you wanted to do some florals, maybe you do 1 or 2 big roses, a medium rose, and a couple of small ones to fill in. I try to cluster. That tends to be my decorating style is that kind of cluster of flowers, either fondant or buttercream. And I will tend to kind of set them in one area. So I will plan to either do like a top rim or a bottom, or I do some in each spot. So think about how you want to lay out your cake. I try to sketch before I start so that I have an idea. Sometimes if you don't and you're just kind of winging it, you end up with a little bit of a mess. So it's a good idea to spend a little bit of time before you are get started. Think about what you want to achieve. You know, do you want letters? Do you want it to say something? Are you decorating for an event or for a person? If you don't have room on your cake and you put your cake on a bigger board, you could always write something on the board, a happy birthday message or something of that effect. So my fondant is nice and pliable now. I worked it a little bit with my hands. So I'm going to put it down. I'm going to roll it out again. And this too, you probably want to go a little bit thinner than you did for the base layer, because we're going to roll it up inside of itself. So I am going to work this out. I don't want any lumps. I'm going to make sure that it's nice and smooth. When you roll your fondant, sorry about my paper all over the place here. When you roll your fondant, I try to go in one direction. So I will roll either forward or backwards, but I don't do a lot of the back and forth because the fondant will get stuck and it will curl up on itself. So go forward, then I will go back a little bit at a time. And then you can see if you need to adjust it. That feels good from a thickness perspective. It's pretty thin. So I'm going to use my middle-sized cutter. And when you're using the fondant cutters, you want to apply even pressure and push down, and then you're going to wiggle it just a little bit. And you push down and you wiggle, and that will ensure that the cutter has gone all the way through, and you lift up, and there is our petals. Okay. So if it's new fondant and it feels okay, like it's still pliable, you're good to proceed. If it feels a little like dried out and hard, you might flip it over and put a little bit of water on it so that it will stick to itself. I don't need the water because my fondant feels okay. But if you were feeling a little bit hard, you could do that with the water. So then you're going to take this set of petals and it kind of mirrors itself on the diagonal. You're going to fold it in half all the way, right, kind of right at the seam. So we end up with 10 petals kind of all in a row. And if anybody has cricketed before, you'll know that this is the same idea when you make paper flowers. You cut out your spiral and then you roll it up. This is the same idea here with this petal. So now I like to start from the outside. There's 2 petals here. And you're going to start twisting. I do the first couple of twists pretty tight because that's going to form like your rosebud. And then you're just spinning it into itself and creating the outer petals. And then once we get the petals all around, you can take your fingers and spread them out a little. And there you have your rose. So there are different ways that you can make these. You can use a ball tool to hammer out kind of your petals if you wanted them to be a little wavy. I'm going to do another one so that you see that process again. So that was, I just cut off the bottom so that it would sit flat on my case when I add it to my decoration. And again, if you're having trouble sticking, if it's having trouble sticking to itself, just go ahead and use a little bit of water, the tiniest of drops, on the fondant will help it stick to itself. Or when you're going to place it on your cake, you can use water to help adhere as well. You can also use piping gel, clear piping gel, or there's a product called Tylose powder that I will mix with a little bit of water if I have a lot of gluing that I'm going to be doing. The Tylose helps the fondant stick to whatever you're trying to adhere it to. Wilton does have a product, let me show you, called Dab and Hold. Comes in a little bottle, and it's similar to Tylose and clear piping gel. I do find it to be a little bit on the yellowish side. So if I have white things that I'm working with, I won't use the Dab and Hold because it sometimes will leave a little bit of discoloration. But for darker colors, I find that the Dab and Hold works okay. And I will usually put that on a plate and paint it on with a paintbrush to control the amount. You need just a teeny tiny little bit. So I'm going to take my fondant scraps and I'm going to re-roll them. I put them together and I'm going to, again, work out a little bit of an area here from my cutter. And you want your cutter to be, you know, to be able to sit on your piece of fondant. So we're going to roll it out. We left a nice space for our cutter. We're going to press down. We're going to wiggle it a little bit so that the cutter is making contact with your seat, your board underneath, my countertop. And then it comes out, right? We have this beautiful fondant stuck in our cutter and we can gently pop it through. So this was the slightly smaller rose cutter. If you wanted to use a ball tool, sometimes when you get those the decorating kits, these come in your kits and you're like, what do I use all these tools for? This is one of those instances where you could take the ball tool and you spin it around the edge of the leaf, the petals, and it kind of flattens it out and it's a little curvy. It's going to spread out the fondant a little bit. And then flip it over and then do the same thing on the other side. So we just kind of spin the ball. We spin the ball tool like this, just in our hand, around the individual petals. And you can see what it's doing. It's kind of stretching out the fondant. You don't need to do this. You certainly can roll it just the way that we did earlier. And then I'm going to fold it back to back so that the edges that I rolled are on the outside. And I'm going to tuck this in. So if you didn't have one of these little petal cutters, how do you think, see, there's our pretty rose. Do you think we could do these flowers another way? We can. So prior to me discovering this nifty little rose petal cutter, I used to make my roses with individual petals. So you can take any piping tip that you have that has a circle end, and the big part or the little part if you want to make very tiny little petals, but I usually use the big side. If you make a series of circles, and then you're going to kind of connect them together. So I'll show you how to do that in case you wanted to make different sizes and you don't have multiple size petal cutters at home. You can use any of your piping tips to create a series of circles, and then we're going to connect those together. So we take our piping tip and we're going to use that as a cutter. I use my piping tips a lot to cut eyeballs. I find that especially when I'm doing fondant decorations, that these are a good size for, it ends up being like the white of the eyes. And then this tip part, this is an Ateco 803, is a good size for a pupil. So I find that it's the right perspective to have the big end and the little end for an eyeball. So you would take these pieces, right? And they kind of look like the same shape as the fondant cutter, right? But they're not connected. So I would take these, I tend to do about 9 per flower. So you can see we're getting the cutter, the petal cutter is a time saver, because instead of cutting 9 times, you're only cutting once. The petal cutters come in packs of 3. You can order them in all different sizes. Again, you can find them on Amazon. You can find them in the decorating stores. There are some really basic decorating tips. I think Amazon has one that's a whole bunch of cutters and tools for around $20. So if you were interested in cake decorating, that's a good set to start with. It comes with some of these like stick tools. It comes with a bunch of cutters. If you were interested in doing more kind of cake decorating, you could definitely invest in some of those tools. It might even have an alphabet set that comes with it for letter cutting, just to see where, what you're interested in and what you'd like to do with it. I've used a variety of types of tools over the years, and I find that the stuff that I can get on Amazon is just as good as what you'd pay for in a specialty store at a fraction of the cost. So I'm all about saving money where I can. I said I have 3 kids, and they do this kind of the bakery on the side, so I can still be a mom and active on the PTA and all of those things. So I try to minimize costs where we can, but still make it as beautiful as possible. So we have 2, 4, 6, 8. There's one more little rose petal here. And then this is going to be a similar outlay. We're going to stack all these little circles together, just like forming a rope. So we're just going to lay them just like this on top of each other. And you're going to press the fondant into itself. And you could, like I said, you could do this with a variety of sizes. So you could certainly start with a smaller circle in the middle to make your rosebud. And then you just twist it together. Oh, and I lost my train here. And if you kind of offset the circles and fan them out as you go, you end up, so you would start your next level kind of halfway in the behind that next petal and go all the way around. My fondant is getting a little bit dry now, so not sticking super well to itself. But then I would use my fingers here to pull those petals out a little bit. And there's our beautiful cutter rose. So you have options. You don't need to use the fancy tools. I would trim the bottom of this one before I would attach it to my cake because it's a little bit pointy. So the end here is going to stick up from my cake. So I would just cut this end and make it flat so that when I went to attach it to my cake, it would sit flat on my cake. I'm just going to show you how that happens. I am using the darker colors now, so I'm going to just use a smidge of the dab and hold on my cake to adhere these roses, but you could just use water. Just going to use this because it's here. Just a little dot, and you put your flower right where you want it to stick. And I'm going to add some of these other decorations right to my cake. So once the cake is fondant, been fondanted, or the fondant has been applied, it really increases the shelf life. You don't need to refrigerate it. I would, in fact, suggest not refrigerating it because it could make it really, really hard. You could definitely do it for a little while to make sure everything had come together, but it's not necessary for like long-term storage. So there are our roses, the collection of roses that we made. Everybody can see. And if I were going to add something to this cake, I would add, a name, or you could write love, or some kind of congratulatory message, or even a happy birthday would fit fine here on the top of this cake. So you have lots of options in terms of decorating. Those are kind of the basics. Are there questions about fondant or tools or things that you have a burning desire to know more about? No? You're all good? Was anybody working alongside of us? Did anybody throw out any roses? No?
I know you told me an interesting fact about fondant, what it actually is. Do you mind telling us a bit more about that?
Yeah. So we were talking a little bit earlier about making fondant taste good. And I said, it's really easy to make your own fondant. You just melt marshmallows and you mix it with powdered sugar. So if anybody wants to try that experiment, you could take a bag of large marshmallows and microwave them until they melt. And then you would add them to your mixing bowl and add enough powdered sugar so that the fondant comes together. And it would look like taffy. You would mix it until it's not shiny anymore, until it gets nice and smooth. And you would have your beautiful own fondant to play with. You could add food coloring to that. You could, it will taste 100 times better than any of the packaged brands. And it's kind of fun for the kids to play with too. So if they want to experiment as well. So marshmallow fondant is the best tasting, but you have to make that yourself. I don't find that any packaged fondant comes nearly as close. But fondant is just sugar really, and some stabilizers. But if you make it yourself, just marshmallows and powdered sugar. Any other questions? I would say thank you for joining us again. We are, again, always open to feedback.
Hi, I have a question.
Sure, go for it.
How did you glue them on? I saw, was that a glue bottle you used?
So this is, yeah.
We're having issues.
Don't worry. This is called Dab and Hold. This is a Wilton product, but you could very easily just use water. If you take a little bit of water on the end of your finger and put it on your cake where you want the rose to adhere, then you could just stick the fondant right on and hold it for a second, and then it should stay just fine. The water works.
Thank you.
Sure. Are you guys working on a project over there?
Yeah, we don't know what we're doing. We're having issues.
All right. Any other questions?
Our pink stuff became black. I haven't figured out how.
Oh, interesting.
Our petals are wilted.
Aww. Anybody else have any questions? If you are working alongside, or you do it at a later date, do send your pictures to Amber at the library. They will post them on their website, and we'd love to know what you thought of the class. So that's let us know. If there are no other questions, I think we're good. I wish everybody a happy spring, and I think we have some really fun stuff on deck for the fall. I think the summer programs are already booked, but I think I'll be back in the fall to do some really fun stuff. So I would encourage you to keep an eye out for the Bite Size Bake Shop and visit us on Instagram and Facebook.
I have a question for you about the Carvel cakes. What do they use in the Carvel cakes to make their, like the piping on that and the roses and things? They taste very different than a normal
Sure, yeah.
cake.
They use, it's like a whipped cream frosting. It's like a whipped cream base. I have found that there's a mix. There's a whipped cream frosting in a box, as silly as this sounds, that is stable at room temperature. And I find that it's the closest in consistency to what they use on the outside of those cakes. You could do it with Cool Whip. You could do it with cream cheese, but I find that it melts, like this stable whipped cream. You mix the box mix with water, and it creates this beautiful frosting. Throw a little extract in there, and you would never know it came out of a box. So that's what I think. You know, the large box stores tend to use more shelf-stable ingredients in their cakes and stuff. But I think that the Carvel cakes, the ice cream cakes, are more like whipped cream frosting.
Thank you.
We have one person who has a hand raised. Feel free to turn off your microphone if you'd like.
We have another question.
I just want to say thank you. This was really informative and helpful.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate that. I hope that you'll experiment, take these ideas and try it in your own lives. And if you find that you have questions after the fact, or you missed something, or you want to go back over it, my name, my email, my phone number are at the top of that question sheet. Feel free to reach out, and I will continue to provide whatever answers I can.
Thank you, Danielle.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I hope everybody has a great night. Enjoy this beautiful weather.
It's okay, Spikes. We're gonna have dinner.
Thank you, Danielle, for the program. I was definitely intrigued by the program. I hope you guys all have a good night.
Great. Thanks so much, Anthony. Thank you, Middle Country Library. Bye, guys.
Bye. Where is it? Stop the video.